we're trying to argue about it. It doesn't mean that we like it. Well, at least I mean, I don't know about Derek.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
like it. I'm a big fan. Well, I can't
Yeah.
say that I like it because I don't have it. Nobody has it yet. But I do generally like money, so I'm pretty sure that I'm gonna like it.
What do you think of the jobs guarantee proposal?
I think that's a bad idea. I think that what a lot of people don't realize is that we already, as a culture, as a society, we're sort of obsessed with creating jobs and guaranteeing work for people. And the whole point of basic income is that we don't have to do that anymore. We can actually allow people to have more access to production, which already exists, and we don't actually need necessarily more work in order to do that. So it's a bad idea to guarantee people jobs.
But I mean, like the thing is, I used to also be a huge proponent of universal basic income, and I'm not saying that I somehow suddenly became enlightened, but I just feel like there's a few problems that are not really mentioned, right?
Well, go ahead, lay them on me, because I feel that a lot of I look at basic income from a different perspective from most people. I'm interested in the economics of it. A lot of people make arguments for it that are not sensible. So I'm interested to hear what you think.
Okay. Well. Let me try to formulate my thoughts. Well, how would you imagine universal basic income? How would you implement it?
So, I think that intuitively, right, everybody can recognize that if the basic income is too low, that's not great because people can't live off of it. If the basic income is too high, then maybe you'd have problems like inflation. So what I tend to recommend is a calibrated basic income. So that means that we have a monetary institution like a central bank or a government calibrate the basic income to match the optimal level for our economy. So you're actually increasing economic production with it, that sort of thing. And and that's it. I mean, I've written some stuff about it, but like that's the basic concept. You calibrate basic income.
Yeah. So under your sort of basic income proposal, would the social welfare state fall away, or would you still have some sort of social welfare structures within a
so this point confuses a lot of people, I think. So a lot of people believe that it's somehow necessary in order to have a basic income that we have to sort of cut out or replace other programs. Now, it's absolutely true that basic income probably is way more efficient than a lot of other current means tested programs. But you don't have to cut those ones or advance. Like, we don't know which programs we have now are necessary or not necessary. It wouldn't make sense to cut out a welfare program and people who needed it are now, like, suffering, right? So it makes more sense, in my view, to raise the basic income. And as the basic income gets higher, well, for one thing, a lot of people they're just not going to be eligible for those programs anymore because their income will be too high. They'll be too rich to qualify as poor. So a lot of those programs, you'll lose, the caseloads will drop, right? As people are bumped out of the eligible income brackets. And then at the same time, also the need for services like food stamps, well, people just won't demand those anymore. They're not going to sign up for those services because they won't need them anymore, right? Because they'll have the money they need to sort of live and survive in the economy. So as you raise the basic income, I would predict that a lot of government expenditures will fall. And then after we've calibrated the basic income, we can decide, okay, did any of these programs, did the caseloads drop to zero? If they did, then we can just cut those programs. There's no need to guess about which ones those will be in advance.
Yes. Now, what about the problem with wages, right? Would you have a minimum wage, right? Would it in effect, would it at the end of the day be sort of a wage subsidy because companies would be, I'm guessing would be on the one hand paying higher taxes, right? But also maybe, I mean, if a worker receives a minimum universal basic income, would that decrease the wages he would receive from his work? Or
it depends. So I would say that as you increase basic income, that's certainly going to have effects on wages throughout the economy. So workers have more bargaining power on one hand. On the other hand, people are less desperate for income sources, right? So how I sum that up is, I would say basic income is going to drive wages up for undesirable labor. If there's jobs that are very unpleasant or difficult or boring, people will demand more wages and they'll be able to get more wages. But for desirable work, work that you kind of would like to do, wages will fall. Your employer will know that you'll still stay working there even if the wages are lower. So basic income will affect wages in that way. As far as a minimum wage goes, I think that's kind of the sort of thing that you only need to have. We only think we need a minimum wage because we don't have a basic income. Once you have a high enough basic income, all that a minimum wage is doing is it's removing from the market any jobs that that might pay out a low wage, a lower than the minimum, and so that reduces economic efficiency. It reduces the amount of basic income we can afford. It's probably better to remove the minimum wage laws, but only after we've raised basic income to its appropriate level.
Okay. So companies would be able to rely on cheaper labor, right, relatively, but they would also in return be paying higher taxes, right?
Well, that depends on your tax policy. So I don't like to think of basic income as attached to any particular tax policy.
Okay.
I think a lot of people have an idea that sort of basic income is funded by higher taxes, but that's not really how government spending works. Government spending is funded by sound monetary policy and by private sector production. So when we talk about taxes, we should think about the effects that taxes have on the output of the economy. Some taxes may actually decrease the amount of basic income we could afford if we were trying. So I don't think basic income should be funded by taxation. I think that should be a separate question, what taxes we think are appropriate.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is the most generic question ever, but how would you fund it?
I would fund it by spending the basic income and calibrating it to its appropriate level. And this would basically be an alternative to existing monetary policy. So the way we currently work the economy, we have private banks and the private financial sector create a lot of new money and loan it into the economy. And we regulate this with central bank policy. And this produces a really astronomical amount of new money for the economy because the economy needs a lot of new money. But we only have to do that because we don't have an efficient mechanism for giving money to consumers. So, the economics answer to how basic income is funded is monetary tightening. As we increase basic income, we're going to reduce the credit stimulus that we're constantly using in our economy, and that'll even out. And as long as there's no inflation, the basic income is fundable. We don't need to worry about where the money comes from or taxes or anything like that.
Oh, I see. So essentially, you're shifting the money that is being sort of injected into the economy from tax and government spending to direct to direct money coming from the government / central bank.
Yes, but to be as accurate as possible, I would say I don't think it's ever true that taxes fund government spending.
Oh no, I agree. I know. I sort of understood your position.
Right, So what basic income is it's a more efficient money creation mechanism than the ones that we currently rely on.
Yes, because the money goes directly to the consumer, right?
Right. So currently, money has to get to consumers somehow, but currently we're injecting the new money through indebted businesses, and then some of those businesses pay out wages to workers. And that's inefficient. It's better to just start the money at the consumer, and then it can be collected by profitable businesses.
I agree. I completely agree.
This is tough though, right? Because a lot of people have a lot of difficulty with that concept. A lot of people think that the money has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, I recently got into modern monetary theory, and it's open up. I don't know if that's what you're referring to.
So sort of. But I would clarify. So my favorite theory is something called consumer monetary theory. My problem with MMT is I think they're absolutely correct.
Yes.
They're correct about what everybody thinks they're wrong about, right? They're correct that deficit spending isn't a big deal.
Yes.
But they also have a lot of other ideas that are not that are kind of weird and are not they just don't make sense.
For example,
they believe.
I mean, I don't want you to you don't have to. Okay.
Yeah,
go ahead.
And I don't want to beat up on them because they do get some things right.
No, go ahead.
But they feel they underappreciate the role of central bank policy in controlling inflation and the role of the private sector. They look at money as basically a tax credit by the state, and they believe that the state's political power to tax drives the value of currency. This is not accurate. Yes. Money is a creature of markets. I mean, it's also a creature of the government, but it has a very, very important role in markets, and the government faces constraints from the market by price setters, and that's important to understand. They want to have they're basically chartalists, meaning that they see the government as sort of decreeing the money into existence. And it's true the government can create money, but their power to do that is limited by inflation. It's limited by a lot of things, and they don't emphasize that enough, in my view.
Okay. Well, are you referring to limitations as in current institutional barriers?
No.
Or I mean, how is it limited?
It's limited with there are real economic constraints on how much a government can spend. Now they understand this, but when they say that money's value is driven by taxes, they're saying that basically that the state's authority to sort of coerce people into giving up some of their money, that sort of it's like a vacuum. It drives the directionality of the currency. But I would actually say what really drives the value of the currency is simply the ability to exchange it for goods and services in the economy. The money is an emergent feature of the economy. And
well, on the one hand, you're talking about value of the currency,
yes.
And I think what they're referring to more is acceptance of that currency, right? Which is through government enforcement of taxation. Value and acceptance, I think. I'm not sure if that's what you're getting to.
I think that might be. They usually talk about value of the currency. They certainly talk about it in terms of the acceptance of the currency is driven by the state's power to tax and provision labor for the economy. Yes. I would argue that actually what drives the value of the currency is sound monetary policy. So somebody somewhere in the economy is making sure that total money spending does not exceed the capacity of the economy to produce goods. If the government fails in that responsibility, make no mistake, markets will find something else to use as money, and the government's currency will inflate. And this now they don't like to emphasize this because they're sort of doing battle with fiscal conservatives, right, who are sort of panicky about inflation. So I understand that, but what they don't recognize is that in order for them to make this claim that there's more spending room available, they have to talk about what the real constraints are, right? And those are not just set by the government's decree or their power to tax. Though it doesn't matter what the tax level is if monetary policy is not calibrated appropriately. So they just have a very, very state heavy view of money. And I would argue that money is separate from the state. Like the state can have a relationship to money. And today in our societies, the government is the one who we tend to think of being in charge of fiscal policy, but it's not necessary that that's the case. Money is also emerges in markets. It's a feature of markets too. And we need to look at it from both perspectives.
Well, money, you said money is, what was the thing with the markets and money? One more time. Is it the markets that, you said markets create money, or was it that markets determine the value of money?
So here's we'll start from the beginning. So my definition of money, if we want to ask like, what is money? First of all, I'm curious, what would you say? I mean, MMT will describe it as a tax credit essentially, but what would you say?
Yes.
What would you say money is?
Well, okay, I haven't thought about this much, so I can't really give an answer to that. You would
no worries. No worries. So the traditional things that people say today, they'll use a couple different definitions. They'll say it's a medium of exchange, it's a unit of account, or it's a store of value. These are common definitions that you hear. The problem with these is, in my view, is that these describe these are properties shared by lots of other assets, lots of other forms of debt in the economy and financial instruments. There's lots of things that have these properties. You can make exchanges with them. They can store value. Actually, when you want to store value, right, you buy an asset like a house or something, and you store value in it. What money is it is the economy's standard of value. So it's a form of debt that everyone in your economy accepts as the standard value. And this is, all markets require this. They require a standard of value in order to set prices. If there's no standard, then we can't have prices for goods. It just doesn't work. And so that is the unique and important feature that money serves in an economy. And this was noticed by someone named John Hicks. His last book he wrote in 1989 pointed this out. And I learned this from my friend Alex Howlett, who's an economic theorist, who's trying to emphasize this feature. It's very cool how in his book how John Hicks sort of like runs through these other different possible definitions of money and just finds them all wanting. None of these are actually describing what do we use money for. We use money to set prices in. We use money as the standard value of everyone, for consumers and producers, for everyone in the economy to use and set prices in. And that's what's important about it.
The point is you can convert different goods into each other.
Yes.
So you don't need, conversion tables. So you don't have to know that 3 apples equals 1 pair of shoes.
Well, yeah, it solves that problem, but it also because you have a single standard that the economy operates in, right? You reduce frictions in exchanges, and so people, you can add more and more people into this common network, right? The economy expands. If you have two separate currencies, two separate standards, they don't work that well. But in practice, in the global economy today, it all sort of does ultimately resolve to one currency network. We've just sort of have these divisions between them. Markets ultimately, they want one standard. They want to be part of a fluid, exchange network of exchanges, purchases, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So you don't think that inflation would explode if you introduce the universal basic income?
I would say.
Well,
Well, go ahead.
okay. Well, I mean, the problem with inflation is that many people misunderstand how inflation works, right? Inflation does not necessarily occur when you increase the money supply. Inflation
I'm not
occurs
really-
when the total demand of an economy outpaces that of its productive capacity, right? And so, I mean, if you would introduce a universal basic income, I would assume that it's probably going to be gradual, right? Because you don't want those inflationary tendencies to um, be exerted.
Yes, very well said. Inflation occurs when total spending exceeds total supply, and the quantity of money of this. This is a lot of people sort of assume implicitly something called quantity theory of money, which emphasizes the total amount of money in the system. Actually, the total amount of money sitting around is really irrelevant for price setters. Price setters care about how much spending is coming their way over a period of time. So as long as as long as total spending isn't exceeding the supply of goods, then you're good. Then money can still serve as that common standard. The consumer price index is stable. Money is useful as a common standard. If it exceeds that amount, then you get inflation, which doesn't mean that the value of goods have changed in the economy. What it means is that the money is worth less because you can't buy goods with it, right? And that's key. That's key to what money is. When we're measuring inflation, like that's actually money. We're measuring the standard value that the economy is using, and that's why inflation is so important. Why we shouldn't have excessive inflation.
It's probably better to raise it over time, raise income over time.
Yes, but this is
that's what
true.
I agree as well. I think okay. Well, that's why I criticize universal basic income, because I think I'm not someone who fetishizes work, right? But I think that the future of our society, the less labor our productive processes require, the more labor we can invest into things that I would define as contributing to overall society, right? In terms of maybe focusing on environmental programs, right? Focusing on cultural programs, on art, on education, all these things that are not necessarily do not necessarily create inherent value in the sense of profit. And so, but I think that we should not detach income from sort of this contribution that one can make to society.
Well, there's a lot there. So the first thing I would say is I really agree with you when you're trying to point out that there's these other things in society that we do that are separate from ordinary economic value, right? There's things that we really value or important to us, things we'll pursue in our lives or work that we'll do that we don't expect to get paid for. Most of the things that are important to us actually are not what we get paid for. The only time that we really need money is when we're trying to get goods from somebody else that we want, right? Money solves that problem. It helps you purchase goods from strangers. It gives you a standard value token so that you have something that you're guaranteed the other person is going to want. And for everything else, you don't need money, right? If people are chatting online in a debate room, no one needs to pay us to show up here. We just do this and this because we want to, and this hopefully will contribute to society in other ways. But for everything that you do need money for, you want people to have enough money. You want them to have the money to buy what's available. And so I would not argue for keeping the amount of income tied to contribution, because there's no guarantee that the wages that happen to get paid out to people are enough to bring consumer spending to its maximum level or to its optimal level. There's actually the opposite is true. Wages are costs, right? You always want more money, but you always want to pay out the lowest wage possible, right? Because you don't want to lose money. So if you notice that every business in the economy, right, they're trying to collect more money than they pay out in wages, you'll realize that new money has to come from somewhere. The money is getting sucked up away from consumers, and it doesn't go back. Some of it goes back, but not all of it. It doesn't just circulate around in the economy. So we need a mechanism to fund consumers, and the way that we're doing that today is we're using monetary policy to create jobs for people, and that's not efficient. In the private sector, we should only have jobs that are profitable, jobs that consumers actually want to buy goods from. And if you're just making it really easy for indebted businesses to stay in business, that's just to pay wages to people because we think it's like morally sound that they work for their money. That's not a good use of resources, right? We're going to actually be sacrificing productive capacity in order to do that.
Okay, so you think that the only way to reach that sort of optimal amount of consumer income / spending is through basic income, universal basic income. That is not necessarily tied to a job.
Yes, it's the only way to efficiently just fund consumers, because in any other way that you do it, like let's say we hire people to build pyramids, like, okay, well, maybe we need a few pyramids, but if you're just building pyramids as an excuse to give people money, you're taking up more resources out of the private sector. You're taking the resources that you need to build the pyramids or do all these other things, right? And it's like, and you're also taking their labor out of the private sector. Maybe that person would have stayed in the private sector and found something to do, produced more profitable businesses or something, helped a business, and that would increase the fiscal capacity of the economy. So it's always, if the goal is just to reduce poverty and give people spending money, it's always more efficient to just give them the money. But meanwhile, everything else that we need, government programs, infrastructure, we should spend that. You know, it uses up fiscal capacity, but if we need the infrastructure, we should have the infrastructure. But the job is just a means to an end. We don't want to create jobs. We want to use jobs efficiently.
But how would, because you said that certain projects would take labor out of the private sector, right?
Yes. Anytime the government hires anyone, there's an opportunity cost on other things, not just private sector work, but also any other work that they might have done just on their own, like social behavior, right? But it's you're taking their time. And so, there's an opportunity cost there. You want to be mindful of that. We can't turn everything into public sector work, because then there's no
I completely agree. Yep, absolutely. But the way I understand a sort of jobs guarantee is not as a replacement for private sector, but as a sort of backup to those who cannot be employed by the private sector, right?
Yes.
But who do want to work.
That's correct. They see it as an automatic counter-cyclical stabilizer. So they're thinking in terms of the government hirings as like filling in the gap left by the private sector. But you see that the way they're looking at the economy in terms of employment. And they want to try to guarantee full employment for everybody. And jobs guarantee solves that problem. Like, it's a very efficient way to solve that problem. But that's the wrong problem to solve, in my opinion. The purpose of the economy is the basic purpose of the economy is to distribute goods to people, to consumers. Consumers are what matter. Now, there's not everything, right, that people need, they're going to be able to buy from markets, but a lot of it is. And so we don't want the government to be guaranteeing jobs. We don't want them to be creating work for people to do, because that reduces the amount of basic income we can afford. So we're going to be tolerating more poverty in the economy than is necessary, right? And you know, not everybody needs to be employed by the private sector or the government necessarily. If we can have a more prosperous economy with less work, that would be desirable, right? And so I'm just trying to separate these two things, which is like wages, which are necessary to have work done, and income sources, right? There's no reason why these have to be seen as the same thing. If you're looking at wages as income sources, then maybe you do have to guarantee jobs. But if you can separate these two things, then actually there's no reason to waste people's time that way. So there's just a fundamental, I get into debates with those other basic income advocates because they sort of see, oh, we can have a basic income and then we can have a jobs guarantee. But I would say that's like, we should have absolutely as many federal jobs as we think we need to do important projects. I'm fully in favor of expanding government spending, but we should be mindful that this does reduce the calibration point of the basic income that the market can withstand. So we should, because we're taking resources out of the private sector. So we should only do that when we need to, when there's something really important that needs doing.
I see. Okay. But then, and I don't know if this is a more conservative argument, but wouldn't that create certain societal tensions when you have
some people working and some people not working?
Yes, and I say this very cautiously because I'm not the type of person who thinks that. Well, okay, let's just get back to the other argument. Would you I mean, won't there be certain societal tensions when you have certain people not working, right, and receiving those benefits?
So I like to think in terms of like cultural tensions. I think it's absolutely true that certainly at first, people will take some getting used to this idea because we live in a culture that we tend to value people based on their contribution, and I think people's contributions are important. But it's also true that people are inherently valuable, right? Innately valuable, and I don't think that it's healthy for us to be looking at society in terms of conflicts between those who work, those who don't. There's always some people that just don't need to be employed by the economy, right? It doesn't make sense to look at using up as much of people's time as possible. We want to use people's time efficiently. If we can enjoy more prosperity, if we can have more opportunity for people to do what they like in life, and then maybe we don't have to look at it this way. Maybe if you're working, right, and getting a wage or making profits, by definition, you're earning more than anyone who's just living on the basic income. So you're getting rewarded for that, right? It's not like, this is what people miss. If you're getting paid to do something, you're getting paid to do it, right? It's not like you're doing it because it's necessarily just because it's noble. You're getting motivated to here's a wage, here's a profit.
Yes.
And so that takes care of that problem. You don't have to be jealous of someone who's not working, because if you wanted to, you could stop working and live off the basic income. But a lot of people, of course, will want more money. People always want more money, right? So I think it's perfectly fine if some people are working, contributing to the economy and getting rewarded for that. And other people who would prefer to spend more of their time how they like can have less money, can have just the basic income.
I personally agree with that notion. I mean, I personally, for example, do not have a problem with that. But if you look at, for example, I'm from Germany, and in Germany we have quite a very hostile position. Well, a lot of people have a very hostile position towards welfare recipients, right? I'm guessing that is the case in the US as well, or in the UK. And isn't that very similar? Because you have people who assume that everyone dependent on welfare is lazy, right? Who does not want to be employed, right? You have this very negative image of welfare recipients. Wouldn't there be something similar under a universal basic income?
I think one enormous difference is that under the current, a really, really big difference. And you see this with the unemployment debacle in the US. Yes. A lot of people are complaining that during the pandemic that, like, well, people who are not working are getting these unemployment benefits, and then they're getting in some cases they're getting as much or more than they were making before.
I know.
And so the person who's still working, who's trying to contribute to society, it feels unfair because they're not getting rewarded, and it is unfair. And so I think a lot of the tension comes from that. I understand some people like to say, oh, other people on welfare are lazy. I don't know if that's helpful. I think that maybe that's comes from the fact that actually when you have an unemployment or welfare, you are rewarding people not to work. You're paying them extra money not to work. But with basic income, you don't have that problem at all, because anyone in a basic income economy, anybody who works even a little bit and makes a little bit of a wage is by definition earning more than someone who doesn't work. And so there's no conflict of incentives.
Okay.
And from that point on in society, we're only rewarding people for contributing, and there's no more rewarding people not to contribute. We're allowing people to not contribute, but there's no rewarding of that going on.
Okay. That does make sense.
I'm not sure that will work.
Okay.
I don't know how to put this. I have to think about it.
Yeah, I know. It's a lot to digest. I completely understand.
It is a lot. It's a very. I'll say this is a very different way of looking at the economy, and I think not even most basic income advocates don't talk about it this way. Most people are still thinking in terms of like, well, it's a more efficient social welfare safety net. But I think that actually, it's sort of the normal way that we should receive income in economies. Like it just makes sense. And it never made sense to rely on wages as like income distribution machines. Their wages are just incentives to get people to reward people for doing work. That's all they have to be. They don't have to be enough to give people incomes.
Yes.
I don't know anything about economy, honestly. So I would actually make some more social argument. Like, are you sure that actually people will work in case they have a basic income that covers all their needs?
So this is why I don't think of it that way. I like to talk about it. Maybe you weren't here earlier, but I like to talk about a calibrated basic income. So it's true that the economy needs work, right?
Yeah.
And so if you were to raise the basic income too high, maybe we actually lose output constraining labor that the economy needed to increase the output of goods and services. And if that occurs, now you're going to have more consumer spending and less goods, and that's basically inflation, right? So what I want to do is only grant the level of basic income that matches our actual real capacity, and that way, what that does is it just brings the economy to full output. It makes everything work better, and it makes sure that the jobs that we have are actually the most efficient jobs in producing goods for consumers, and we don't need, and it helps us get rid of unnecessary jobs. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah. I understand the point, but like, don't you think that if you do that, if you calibrate the basic income, you will actually end up with a very, very, very low basic income, because if you raise it higher than that, people will not work.
So this is the cool thing about this idea. So you can imagine, let's imagine a couple different human species. Let's imagine a human civilization that on average, people were actually lazier than we are on average. They're just, they needed more motivation to work hard, right? And then let's imagine other human beings that were much more motivated, and they didn't take that much motivation to get them to do work, right? Well, in all three of these worlds, ours and theirs, there is a calibration point, right? But once you find that calibration point, let's say it's low, very low for the lazy humans. Well, over time, as these lazier humans, eventually get off their butts and start making technology because the basic income is low, they create more machines, more economic production, more innovations, and then they can afford a slightly higher calibration point. And when you keep going down that road, as the economy develops, we get new machines, new technology. Well, so the calibration point is it's the optimal level of basic income, and it means that we have the
why would raise? I didn't understand that.
Okay, so I'll try it again. So so the basic idea is that at any given state of the economy's productivity, you can afford a certain amount of basic income before you end up overshooting the economy's capacity, right? You ruin the effectiveness of wages as incentives. There's not enough goods. So, but just like how in the economy, right, as the economy grows, there's more room for government spending in general. Like if governments want, they can just take a bunch of people out of the private sector and hire them to be soldiers. Like a tiny economy can only have a little tiny army, but a really big economy could have a really, really big army. There's more slack in the economy. You can take more people out and make them go fight wars, right? Well, in exactly the same way, this optimal level of basic income, the amount of money you can just give to people for being members of society, that can increase as efficiency of production develops. And so even if human beings were lazier than they were, right, that would mean that when you start implementing the basic income, it calibrates lower. But over time, the calibration point, as long as you've calibrated it correctly, it's always going to increase. We want a higher basic income over time. So even if human beings were much lazier than they are, that might mean that economic progress would be slower than ours in general, but there's always an optimal level of basic income that just helps your economy produce the right amount of goods for people.
It goes up because you have more money?
Well, no. So economies develop because, well, it's not just because people are working or working harder, right? Most of our economic efficiency advantages come from technological innovation, organizing production more efficiently, right? Connecting with more people in different economies and trading, right? There's all of these efficiency network advantages that build over time. And most of that, it doesn't have to do with how many people are working. It has to do with how efficient is our our systems of production, how much, because anytime you add technology, right, what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of goods production with less human labor time required. So instead of taking 100 people to till a field, now you just have one dude in a machine, right? So all of these are efficiency gains. And as long as there are efficiency gains, you can slightly increase the basic income over time. So it's all we're doing is distributing the efficiency gains across the economy.
Yep. And that does make sense. Absolutely.
And one thing maybe people don't realize is that we already do this. It's just that we're doing it with other tools that are less efficient. So we're using credit stimulus. We're actually bringing the economy to its credit calibration point, where we're trying to pump cheap credit to businesses as much as possible to sort of keep businesses growing, keep wages growing. And it's the same thing. It's kind of backwards, right? We're growing the amount of businesses, but consumer spending is really scarce. So we can't actually figure out which businesses are efficient, right, and actually meeting the demands of consumers.
Isn't that exactly the reason why a lot of economies across the globe have been stagnating? Is because the wages have not been increasing with productivity?
Yes, and so we're trying really hard to create more jobs, have more wages, and we're also trying to sort of push the wages up. There's lots of incentives for us to try to keep wages high because those are our income sources. But the reality is that any business, it's in its interest to keep its wages low. It's trying to keep wages as low as possible. And that's not a bad thing for consumers. It means that the cost of goods can be cheaper, right? So we're looking at it all wrong. We should let wages, we should have an efficient labor market. Wages should be whatever they need to be to motivate people to do work efficiently. But the income sources can be higher.
Oh, hold on. One second. Because you mentioned labor markets, right?
Yeah.
You said that labor markets should the wage that ends up coming out of a competitive labor market, right? Mm-hmm. Should incentivize people to do work, right?
Yes, it should only be as high as it needs to be to incentivize people to do the work. If it's any higher than that, then it's not efficient. You're paying more for labor than you need to.
Okay, but okay. This is how I always viewed it. I think I was always told that a labor market is inherently efficient, right? Because it will always be paying, because companies will be able to pay the amount of money that stems from the difference between supply and demand of labor, right?
So I would question the idea that labor markets are always efficient, because we're actually we're interfering with them a lot with government policy. But we're deliberately growing. Like, what an efficient labor market looks like? It looks like the Great Depression, because there's no jobs for anybody. But
exactly.
We took government policy and we started inflating the labor market. But so I want to understand your what you said. So what was the other thing you said? You said that
So the labor market, the wage that sort of results out of a labor market is when you have either oversupply or undersupply of labor, right? Depending on demand for labor. So if there's more labor than demanded, the wages will go down.
Yes.
If there's less labor than is demanded, the wages will go up.
Yes.
Now I see an inherent problem with that currently, is because we have a oversupply of labor, right, in many places, which is why wages are able to be driven down so effectively. And from the point of view of a business, that might make sense because you're able to cut costs, right? But through these low wages, you're also effectively removing demand from the economy.
Yes,
right?
Yes, and that's only because we lack a basic income. Now, if you think about an economy that has a basic income, this isn't a problem. What demand is its own thing. We're making sure consumers have the right level of demand, and then wages can be whatever they want. So companies can they'll try to pay as low wages as possible, but workers that are skilled and are in demand, like, they can ask for slightly higher wages, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. And you can let that dynamic play out and let wages be evaluated as they need to. But that doesn't come with the sacrifice of consumer demand. So in our economies, if we remove unnecessary jobs from our economy, or jobs that consumers don't want, if we remove those jobs, we're simultaneously removing consumer demand. So now essential businesses start closing because there's no consumer spending. So we've tied these two things together, and they're kind of in this very unfortunate death race. And this is what we call recessions, right? When suddenly we remove unnecessary jobs from the economy, suddenly consumer spending dries up. And you only have those because we lack a basic income. We lack a reliable mechanism for distributing spending money into the economy.
Well, okay, I wouldn't. Yes, yes, but I don't think that the reason for the current current problem of low wages is because of the lack of a minimum wage. I think that it is due to the weak bargaining power of unions, for example, right? It is due to the fact that we do have a quite a low minimum wage in most countries, adjusted to inflation and living costs and the productivity development over the last few years. Um, but I mean, I agree that a minimum wage a minimum income could solve those problems. I just don't think that the lack of a minimum income is what's driving these low wages.
So I know this is a kind of a different, very, very different way of looking at the problem. But if you think about it from an economic perspective or from a business's perspective, we want wages to be low. Wages are cost. So think about it. Let's say imagine a business that didn't need any human labor, and it was just acquiring resources. Well, we would want the cost, if it could find a way to produce more goods and better goods with cheaper resources or fewer resources, that would be good. We would want that to occur, right?
Yes.
And it's only when we suddenly when suddenly we're the resource being used where we go, oh, I want my value to be really high. I want my, but the problem is that that's only because we're looking at the wages as an income source. Like if really what we want is for people's contributions to be valued appropriately. We want wages to be low if they're going to be low. And for the past century or longer, we've come up with these other ways to keep wages high. So labor unions is a way we can do that. We can try to increase worker bargaining power and force up wages. Minimum wage law is another way to force up wages. But if you have a basic income, you don't need to do that. If you just raise the basic income, well, every worker is also a consumer, right? So now their income is higher. And if their wages, some wages get lower, some wages get higher, that's not a problem because you're making sure they still have income, right? We can raise the basic income. And then you can let the labor market just sort of be economically efficient in the traditional sense. We can use people's time more like we use other resources, like efficiently, right? We don't want to just use all the resources that are available. We want to use them efficiently. We only want to use them only when we need to. And that's why I'll take this extra step and I'll say, it's not that wages are too low, we need more unions. It's like, no, we lack basic income. Like this is just a basic thing that helps an economy stay efficient, kind of like the invention of monetary policy. Like it's just a tool that helps us manage the economy. It's like it keeps the economy efficient, and we just haven't come up with it until now. We just didn't think to do it.
Okay. Now, if the government, in combination with the central bank, were to introduce these enormous amounts of money into the economy, right, through basic minimum income, minimum wage, minimum income,
basic income,
would you be increasing taxes? Because at the end of the day, you do have to drain some of that money out of the economy, right?
So I would say no. So MMT advocates will stress that they'll try to talk about taxes as an inflation control mechanism. The reality is that how we control inflation today is with monetary policy. And so what central banks do is they adjust interest rates on government bonds, and they adjust those as needed. They adjust the quantity of bonds in the market and the rates that are paying in order to attract investment out of the economy. So basically they're paying people to save their money. They pay people a little bit of money to just put their money outside of the economy on government balance sheets. And this is actually what all of our taxes, people fight about them politically. They argue about who should we tax, who should we not tax. Taxes are never used to control inflation. What is much more effective is actually paying people to save their money. And that actually reduces the amount of spending in the economy.
Interesting. Okay.
How I look at taxes are what taxes will do is they're disciplinary. They conserve resources. They disincentivize people to consume or produce certain resources. So if you don't want people to be if you don't want people to be using up a lot of steel, you tax steel, and then you're going to free up those resources for something else. That's what tax is for, and taxes in no way control inflation.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, the way the MMT proponents view it is that you're effectively just removing excess demand from the economy, right? Through taxation.
That's how they look at it. But the problem is that, we can ask who are we taxing? So imagine that we're taxing rich people. Okay, so rich people, they buy luxury goods and things, but they have a much lower marginal propensity to consume than
Uh-huh.
than the poorest person in the economy. If you give the poor person money, he's going to spend that money in the economy. If you give a rich person money, it's like you didn't give them any money at all,
Yeah.
right? And so we can tax rich people if we want to reduce inequality or something like that, but it doesn't actually, it's not effective as a means of controlling spending. So if you imagine a hyperinflating economy like Zimbabwe or something, right, and there's too much spending going on and there's not enough resources, let's say that you just raise taxes on the rich like crazy and you raise them to 80% or something. Well, if it was the average aggregate population spending that was causing the inflation, then you didn't necessarily reduce the spending that you needed to spend. What matters is total spending in the economy, and tax is a tool you can use to manage that, but it's not necessarily the most efficient tool. You could have a bond drive and you could just encourage everybody to save their money, encourage the average consumer to not spend money like we did in war times, right? Keynesian war bonds. And that works much better. Like you pay people a little bit of money to stop spending. And then it turns out people like that a lot better than taxes. And that's exactly why monetary policy is what we rely on to control inflation today. And taxes are kind of this irrelevant sideshow. They're not really related to inflation control.
Uh-huh. Yeah, okay. I agree. Okay, wow. Yeah, that was very, very convincing. Do you have any literature you could recommend on your certain sort of conception of universal basic income? Slash what other thing, the consumer monetary theory?
Yes, that's exactly it. So the theoretical framework, the person who came up with this is named Alex Howlett, and he calls it, consumer monetary theory. It's just his way of looking at the economy. And I think it's a sensible way of looking at the economy. I found it very convincing when I first heard of it. So let me send you, I have a YouTube channel where I talk about this stuff, and I wrote a paper about it, and Alex writes a lot of stuff about it. So I'll send you the resources. Just give me a second.
With Alex Howlett with O-W?
Howlett.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. Perfect. I found him.
I'll send you what I think are just like the basic important sources.
Perfect.